Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to what is our first event at the History Center for this academic year. My name is Pat Sullivan, and it's really a pleasure to welcome Dan Geary, who is the Mark Piggott Assistant Professor of History at Trinity College in Dublin, to speak with us today about his new book, Beyond Civil Rights. Dan is familiar with the South. He grew up in Williamsburg, Virginia, and his interest in history was sparked by his reaction to the reenactors and all the colonial stuff that surrounded him in his youth. He took his undergraduate degree at the University of Virginia and took his PhD at the University of California in Berkeley. He works in the fields of intellectual, political, and cultural history, and his work sort of bridges a number of really fascinating areas that interface very well with each other. Political ideologies and movements, the development of American ideas about race and ethnicity, and the history of social sciences and their role in the shaping of public discourse and public policy. His first book, which was published in 2009, was titled Radical Ambition, C. Wright Mills, The Left, and American Social Thought. This book was praised as brilliant, sophisticated, and engaging, and credited for recovering an iconic figure in the post-World War II period in all of his magnificent ambition and complexity. A really terrific and important book. But I came to know Dan through his work on the Moynihan Report. As a scholar of the Civil Rights Movement and working on the 1960s right now, Moynihan is someone who's intrigued me. And he wrote a fabulous article in Datalist that was contributed to this book. So I sought him out when I went to Ireland in 2013 to escape America during the 50th anniversary of JFK's assassination. And what a great meeting it was. So I'm delighted that his book is finally out and that he's with us here today. As many of you probably know, much has been written about Daniel Patrick Moynihan and his report on the Negro family, the case for national action. But until Dan came along and really dove into the archives of the Library of Congress, little sustained attention has been paid to the reactions to the Moynihan Report and the explosive debates that it sparked regarding race, poverty, gender roles, family structure, and the role of the government in meeting the racial inequalities so deep in our society. So what Dan argues very convincingly is what Moynihan intended to do, and that is very interesting, and he deals with that in this book. And Moynihan is a fascinating character, and you get great insight into him here. But that is less significant than the controversy the report engendered. One that was broad-ranging, involved many segments of academia, public policy circles, and the general public, and really extended from the late 1960s onward to this very day. I mean, as demonstrated in the recent sort of dust-up, I guess you'd call it, between Police Commissioner Bratton and Mayor de Blasio regarding crime rates in New York. The Moynihan Report was centered right in the middle of that. Bratton just used it as a touchstone to try to explain what was happening in black neighborhoods in New York City, poor black neighborhoods. And then, of course, most recently in the October issue of The Atlantic, where Dan online has an annotated edition of the Moynihan Report you can check out. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has a lead article showing again that the Moynihan Report continues to be a touchstone for commentators struggling to explain the roots and costs of racial inequality and division in American society. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dan. Oh, your notes. Let's see how much you really know.
I don't like your notes. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the History Center, History Department, and University for bringing me here. It's wonderful to be here. And a special thank you to Pat, not only for bringing me here, but also for her crucial support for this project at an important time. You know, it's nice when you publish a book to have people say good things about it, but when you really need people to say good things about it is when you're actually writing it, when you're putting in that hard work, mostly by yourself, day after day. And Pat provided crucial support as well as very useful criticism for me during the writing of this book. So I'm forever grateful for that. So what I'm going to do today is try to outline some of the main arguments of the book, to clarify some of its arguments in light of a few of the criticisms it's received. Not that I would expect anyone to be paying attention to that, but this is my chance to set the record straight. And also to discuss some of the recent implications of the Moynihan Report, some of which Pat mentioned and I'll get to as well. Now, I wrote my book to be out in time for the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan Report, but I have to confess that even I have been taken aback at the extent to which the report has been in the news lately. So on August 31st of this year, on the MSNBC program Morning Joe, New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton controversially declared that he had discovered the cause of a recent crime wave in a 50-year-old government report written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And you can see the quote here. He said, "Talk about being prescient about what was going to happen in black society in terms of he was right on the money, the disintegration of family, the disintegration of values." Bratton's remarks, made of course in a broader context of growing outrage against police violence and mass incarceration, seem to attribute black criminality to the flawed family structure and cultural values of African Americans. These remarks are just one indication of the enduring salience of the Moynihan Report, the 1965 document officially entitled The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, which argued that the, quote, damaged family structure of many African American families, as reflected in high rates of female-headed families and high rates of out-of-wedlock births, would, in Moynihan's view, hinder efforts to achieve racial equality following the passage of civil rights legislation. Family structure, Moynihan argued, stood at the heart of what he notoriously labeled a tangle of pathology evident in high rates of juvenile delinquency, drug abuse, and poor educational achievement among African Americans. Now, as the author of a book about the Moynihan Report, I should hardly have been surprised by Bratton's remarks, nor by the recent invocations of the report by the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, the Manhattan Institute, and by journalists Nicholas Kristof, George Will, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. For the thesis of my study is that for 50 years, the Moynihan Report has served to generate debate about the causes of persistent inequality in America. It has been a Rorschach test inviting viewers to see in it what they want, as well as a litmus test revealing deep ideological cleavages. Now, Bratton presented his comments as a spontaneous reaction to something that he just happened to read over the weekend. You wonder what Bratton normally does on the weekend. Find old government reports and read, apparently. But regardless of how he actually came across this thing in the first place, his remarks fit in a long line of arguments coming out of the report, repeatedly articulated by conservatives, which attribute inequality and social problems such as crime among African Americans to the social and cultural characteristics of African Americans themselves, namely what Bratton called the disintegration of the family. But in another sense, Bratton's use of the Moynihan Report struck me as simply bizarre. When you write a history book about a subject, you expect that however much that book might shed light on the present, it is about a past subject. And here's a prominent political figure using the report as if it had been written yesterday and its analysis explained events today. Now, I spent many years trying to view the Moynihan Report historically to explain the context in which it was written and in which different arguments about it had formed. And Bratton's remarks, I think, helped me realize that above all, my book is an attempt to historicize the Moynihan Report and the controversy over it. It's not primarily an attempt to explain whether or not Moynihan was right and how his analysis might apply today, although of course I have views on those matters and I will articulate them later in this talk. But rather, my book principally tries to explain simply where Moynihan's ideas came from and what political context he operated, and most importantly, why the report has been praised and damned from so many different perspectives for going on 50 years. Now, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has probably not read my book, but he did convey some of the Moynihan Report's historicity when he publicly rebuked his police commissioner the day following his remarks. De Blasio said, quote, "That report is literally half a century old, and I think society has changed a lot. I think there are some assumptions in that report that just don't hold today. I just think it's a report from another time. This rare public sparring between the mayor and the police commissioner indicates the passion that this report still manages to generate. And interestingly, though, Bratton, as I suggested before, hinted at a well-worn conservative interpretation of the report in his initial comments, seeming to attribute African-American crime to some form of cultural deficiency. His subsequent remarks 2 days later, now in the face of criticism from the mayor, as well as some members of the city council, one of whom called the report racist, Bratton then appealed to a different reading of the Moynihan report, one that emphasized the need for government action to redress historical wrongs. So I'll quote you here. This is a long quote from Bratton. This is responding to his critics, sort of changing tack a little bit. He said, quote, "There is no denying in the African-American community that there are strong cultural, strong religious, strong community values, but that over time, and this is what the Moynihan report spoke to, there is no community that has been so stressed over time as the African-American community. 250 years of slavery, 150 years of Jim Crow." I don't know where we got this 150 years. Maybe he accepts Michelle Alexander's argument about the new Jim Crow. I don't know. But he said 150 years of Jim Crow, the segregation that spawned the civil rights movement, and at the time the report was written, it was a call to action to assist a community that had been impacted like no other community in our history. And he went on to say, "My takeaway, my prism, if you will, in the Moynihan report was, he was saying to the United States of America, we have damaged this community to an extraordinary degree, and as a country, we need to come together to work with them to ensure they get all the benefits of American society." A call to action, that's how I read the report. Pretty different from what he had said just a few days before. And by invoking different interpretations of the report in literally in the same week, Bratton illustrated, I think, one of my book's central arguments, which is that the Moynihan report was open to multiple ideological uses. It didn't have a single political meaning, but was used in different ways. Specifically, well, there's a variety of ways, but the two main ones I've outlined already. Bratton's attempt to use the report to explain social problems among African Americans as resulting from some kind of cultural deficiency, and secondly, an attempt to argue for government action and seeing such social problems as rooted in history of racism. Now, when I made this argument that the Moynihan report is open to multiple ideological uses, I broke with most previous histories of the Moynihan report controversy, which sought primarily to establish the document's true meaning. For some historians, the Moynihan report is an essentially conservative document that pioneered the use of the image of supposedly deficient African-American families to undermine the welfare state. Other historians, now I think probably in the majority, have argued that it was an inherently liberal document using the issue of family to push for jobs programs and other measures to benefit African Americans. Now, I think the document was both liberal and conservative, and that the controversy about it cannot be understood as a simple case of, and here I'm quoting historian James Patterson, a case of, quote, misunderstandings and misrepresentations. In fact, my book argues that the report has been so open to competing interpretations because of its own inconsistencies, its own ambiguities, as well as its embodiment of a series of contentious assumptions about race, gender, social expertise, and the role of government that all came under challenge in the late 60s and 1970s. All right, so there's Moynihan. Moynihan wrote at the dawn of a new era in American race relations. Landmark legislation in 1964, 1965 ended Jim Crow segregation, granted formal equality to African Americans, and discredited overt arguments for white supremacy. Yet Moynihan's opening sentence warned the United States is approaching a new crisis in race relations. This crisis, he wrote, resulted from African American demands that went, quote, beyond civil rights to include economic, quote, equality, with Moynihan's term. And that, of course, that's the title of my book, where comes from Beyond Civil Rights, which I should again credit Pat for giving me the title. I couldn't figure that out. She's the one who came up with this. And the reason why I chose that as a title basically is to indicate the importance of the historical moment at which this report was written and the way that debates over the Moynihan report have been crucial really in shaping different ideas about African American inequality since the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Moynihan accepted the legitimacy of the demands of the civil rights movement for a basic standard of living for all Americans. But his thesis that attempts to achieve racial equality would be primarily undermined by what he saw as family instability produced conflicting notions about how to combat racial inequality. Focus on male unemployment's destructive effects on families seemed to indicate the need for an activist state to surpass the limited anti-poverty measures enacted by Johnson during the War on Poverty and ensure full male employment and a guaranteed annual income. Moynihan later explained his strategy of appealing to family to win support from white Americans for broader programs. He said, quote, "By couching the issue in terms of family, white America could be brought to see the tired-old issues of employment, housing, discrimination, and such in terms of much greater urgency than they evoke on their own." Moynihan's report, in fact, did capture the attention of President Johnson and shaped his rhetoric in a noted speech at Howard University, where Johnson declared, "Freedom is not enough." But Moynihan's call for national action was, in one sense, dead on arrival. Moynihan knew that Johnson opposed the employment programs he thought were needed to provide jobs to African-American men and stabilize their families. So Moynihan left his proposal for public works programs, New Deal-style public works programs. He left that proposal out of the report entirely. He didn't even propose it because he knew that Johnson would not accept it. Moreover, and here's where the inconsistencies of the report come in, moreover, Moynihan undermined his own case for national action in the report by treating family, quote, pathology, not simply as an effect of economic inequality, but as the primary cause of what he saw as the inability of African Americans to compete with other ethno-racial groups. Here, Moynihan drew from a different intellectual tradition that conflicted with his calls for full employment programs. And I want to be clear about my argument here because some have made the point, well, you can't blame Moynihan for the conservative implications that have been made of his report. In a sense, that's true. I mean, you can't simply say because conservatives have used it that the report is inconsistent. So I'm making a case that there actually are inconsistencies within the report that explain the different uses of it. It's not just that conservatives have misused it. So Moynihan's view of American race relations was profoundly influenced by his role in co-writing the book Beyond the Melting Pot with Nathan Glaser. Glaser is the author most cited in the Moynihan report. Glaser, a Jewish sociologist, in this book, Beyond the Melting Pot, really a very influential 1963 study of various groups in New York City. You can see them listed there on the cover. Glaser enlisted Moynihan to write the chapter on the Irish of New York. But Glaser's own chapter on African Americans, I think, profoundly influenced Moynihan, as did his general view of how racial relations in the United States work. Beyond the Melting Pot viewed African Americans through the lens of the European immigrant experience and suggested that ethno-racial groups in the U.S. succeeded or failed economically on the basis of sociological characteristics such as, prominently, family structure. So here to Glaser, family structure was not an effect of economic inequality, but actually its cause. And Glaser, in his chapter on African Americans for Beyond the Melting Pot, suggested that problems of family disorganization, as he called it, crime, juvenile delinquency, and educational achievement could best be met not by government programs, but by private black organizations. These were tasks, he wrote, quote, that conceivably no one but Negroes can do. Even while counseling racial self-help, though, Glaser claimed that, quote, Negro communal organization is too weak and insufficient to make much impact on the great needs of the poor and disorganized part of the community. Thus, Glaser suggested, in effect, that the low socioeconomic position of black Americans was an intractable problem, and one that was the responsibility of African Americans to solve, although he was pessimistic that they would actually solve it. I interviewed Glaser for this book. He's still alive, and I said, "Is this what you argued in this book?" And he said, "That's what I said. Maybe I was right, maybe I was wrong, but that's what I said." So I appreciated that from him, because sometimes you interview people and they're so concerned to protect their own legacy. He wasn't concerned to do that. He was very open that that's what he was saying. And Moynihan, I think, was a bit more optimistic about the role of government than Glaser was, but he too adopted Glaser's model of ethno-racial competition, groups competing with one another and succeeding on the basis of different sociological characteristics like family structure. And that model led Moynihan to focus in his report on defects among African Americans themselves, not on structural constraints of institutional racism. It was also behind Moynihan's assertion in the report that family structure was, quote, the fundamental source of the weakness of Negro community. Well, if that were true, then African American inequality, as Glaser himself has suggested, could not be effectively addressed by government action. The report's central inconsistency that I've laid out, whether family instability was a symptom of broader inequality or, in fact, its primary cause, meant that it was immediately cited by liberals favoring national action and conservatives promoting racial self-help. After the report was released in August 1965, it won defenders as ideologically diverse as Martin Luther King and William Buckley. Not normally known for agreeing on those two. So in a 1966 speech in Chicago, King endorsed Moynihan's, quote, alarming conclusion that the Negro family is crumbling and disintegrating. King saw the report as offering a, quote, opportunity to deal fully rather than haphazardly with the problem as a whole, to see it as a social catastrophe, and meet it as other disasters are met with an adequacy of resources. Buckley, on the other hand, was one of the first to see the conservative uses of Moynihan's ideas. He drew on Moynihan and Glaser, in fact, in his 1965 New York City mayoral campaign to deny white responsibility for the low economic positions of African Americans and Puerto Ricans in New York City. In an October 1965 speech citing Beyond the Melting Pot, Buckley asserted, quote, the situation in Harlem is dire and dreadful, and the moment has come when the government's competence in these matters having been largely exhausted, leaders of the Negro people must take on the responsibility of helping their own people in dispelling the illusion that what is left to do is primarily up to the white man to do. So here you have a white conservative advocating racial self-help for African Americans and saying that's the only solution, the government can't do anything. Now, the New York Times chastised Buckley for appealing to what it called racism and bigotry. And in fact, Buckley, even though he was came from patrician roots, he won the support of, I suppose, many white ethnics in New York City, stirring up racial resentment among them. So when the Times said Buckley was appealing to racism and bigotry, Buckley charged the paper for hypocrisy for having praised Glaser and Moynihan for having made essentially the identical argument. For his part, Moynihan, who appreciated the support Buckley gave him at a time when many on the left were attacking him, actually became friends with Buckley in the late 1960s, and reportedly declared in a radio interview that, quote, everything Mr. Buckley has said on the Negro question is a plagiarism taken straight out of my book, Beyond the Melting Pot. Now, Moynihan, of course, was also attacked at the time. There was more support for Moynihan than I think is widely known. What it's best known for is the fact that it was quite controversial and eventually shelved by the Johnson administration, which quickly disowned Moynihan and the conclusions of the report. So I'll just can't go into too much detail here, but I do want to talk about the most famous criticism of the report that had, quote, blamed the victim. And this was a charge made by William Ryan, a white civil rights activist from Boston, who coined the phrase blame the victim. It comes from the Moynihan report controversy. He didn't actually use it in 1965. He coins it later, but the idea is there in his attack on Moynihan. In fact, he writes his later book, Blame the Victim, because the editor of The Nation, Karen Williams, who asked him to write the piece, said, look, can you find other examples like the Moynihan report of what you're talking about here? So what did Ryan mean when he said that Moynihan blamed the victim? I think to a certain degree, Ryan is being misunderstood in some of the contemporary discussions. If you read Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece in The Atlantic and some of his interviews around it, he says, well, of course Moynihan wasn't blaming the victim because he recognized the roots of problems in slavery and racial discrimination. Well, Ryan knew that. He wasn't saying that Moynihan ignored that. In fact, what Ryan said about that was that he said Moynihan was quote, copying a plea by pleading guilty to past racism, not having to take responsibility for current, present-day racism. And that's what Ryan mostly meant by blaming the victim, was that by stressing the internal characteristics of African Americans, Moynihan was ignoring systemic racism and ignoring institutional racism in American society. So that's what Ryan's argument was. It was a subtle and sophisticated argument, as were the arguments of many of Moynihan's other critics. It wasn't a simple misreading of the report. Now, Moynihan's report received such diverse and heated reactions, not only because of the confusion over whether it called for national action or blamed the victim, but also because it articulated assumptions widely shared among early 1960s liberals that came under intense challenge just around the time of the report's release. Most liberals, Moynihan's time, believed in the government's ability to alleviate economic inequality without reforming corporate capitalism, in the cultural assimilation of ethno-racial minorities, in the desirability of male-headed families, in the efficacy of social engineering by experts and government officials, and in the superiority of middle-class American values. And all those things came under intense challenge in the late 1960s. I think that the combustibility of Moynihan's assumptions about race, gender, and government was clearest in reactions to his report's most concrete policy for African American advancement, recruiting more black men into the military. This is pretty much the only clear suggestion in the Moynihan report. He made other policy suggestions in a memo to Johnson, but in the report itself, it's really the only clear policy suggestion we'll find. Now, this proposal definitely fit a liberal strategy to provide jobs to male breadwinners to stabilize African American families and communities. This was something that, as Moynihan understood, could be done without a political fight. You know, the government could decide on its own to recruit more African Americans into the military, therefore giving them jobs. This idea also reflected a belief that success in American society required middle-class values that were presumed lacking among African Americans. In the Army, Moynihan alleged, black men would learn, quote, discipline. This proposal also reflected Moynihan's belief that African American men suffered from a, quote, matriarchal culture. The military would provide them with a, quote, utterly masculine world, a world away from women, a world run by strong men of unquestioned authority. Moynihan's suggestion advanced during the rapid escalation of the Vietnam War, met opposition from several fronts. Many black power advocates rejected military service as participation in an American imperialism that targeted non-whites abroad, just as it oppressed non-whites at home. Men involved in the anti-war and countercultural movements rejected Moynihan's equation of masculinity with submission to hierarchical discipline. And feminists viewed the plan as a brief for patriarchy. One feminist mocked Moynihan for assuming, quote, women are so terrible that it's a fantastic relief to get away from them. Never mind that the service is experiencing explosive racial problems. It's still better than being around women. Moynihan report's commitment to patriarchal families was, I think, central to its meaning. And those who seek to revive the report today in the context of vastly changed family norms, I think, have to address this fact. Too often people have supported the Moynihan report, whether from a liberal or conservative perspective, was failing to take on its notion of what a family was, which Moynihan was quite open about. And many conservative supporters of the Moynihan report actually pick up on this and see it positively. Many liberal supporters of the report often try to brush this issue, I think, under the rug a little bit. But I also think the fact that the Moynihan report touched on so many different issues is what helped make it the powerful symbol that it did become, and it's why it's part of the reason why it's so talked about today. That is to say, it's a report not just about, as often seen, not just about the African American families or about racial inequality, but about a broad range of issues that it touches upon. And in fact, one of the things I stress in my book is that racial discourse is always embedded in such broader ideas. And that's why I was surprised when I was recently criticized for ignoring the class dimensions of the Moynihan report in an article by Torrey Reed that intriguingly juxtaposes the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan report with the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And Reed claims that I criticized Moynihan solely for his racial insensitivity, but missed the ways that Moynihan naturalized the capitalist marketplace, even as he advocated liberal reforms. So I just want to be clear that when I talk about the Moynihan report having been used to rationalize inequality, which is one of the things, one of the arguments of the book, I mean not only racial inequality, but also class and gender inequality as well. And what makes the report even more complex is that not only has it been used to rationalize inequality, at times it has been used to challenge certain forms of inequality while naturalizing other others, as with Moynihan's really central preoccupation with providing jobs for black men so they could serve as family patriarchs, even to the extent that Moynihan openly advocated taking jobs away from African American women to give them to African American men. Now, obviously, I can't share all the ideas in my book with you today, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions. But I hope I've convinced you at least that the Moynihan Report has a complex history that belies its use as a simple talking point for the left or for the right. And I want to conclude, though, by discussing my own views of how the report should be used in contemporary political debate. I did not come to this project with a personal investment in the Moynihan Report meaning one thing or another. That's not to say I didn't have ideas about the issues expressed in the report. Of course, I did. Every historian comes to the project with their own prejudices. What I do mean is it didn't matter to me whether someone saw the report as liberal or conservative. I wasn't trying to claim the report for some contemporary political cause. And I'd like to think that my history could stand on its own and be of use to contemporary defenders and opponents of the report alike. But I do feel a responsibility to engage the current discussion on the report, to draw my own lessons from the history I've told. I mean, after all, if we historians don't draw historical lessons for contemporary debate, then who will? The lessons that I draw are really drawn for those like myself who consider themselves liberals or even leftists and believe that if our society is truly committed to equality, then it requires a truly massive redistribution of its resources. But I think others with different political views might draw different lessons, at least I hope they would in my book. Now, one of the things that my work on the book led me to conclude was that liberals who have defended the Moynihan Report have erred. And I'm thinking here particularly about William Julius Wilson, the African-American sociologist who really sought to revive the Moynihan Report as a liberal document in his 1987 book, The Truly Disadvantaged, when he declared he was, quote, following in the footsteps of Moynihan. And he and many other liberals like him have sought to defend the report since then. But as I write in my book, the Moynihan Report embodies not only the ambitions of 1960s liberalism, but also all of its shortcomings. Sure, at its best, it called for national action to ensure social and economic equality for African Americans, not just the legal equality that had been ostensibly granted during the civil rights movement. But at its worst, the report conflated racial equality with patriarchy and encouraged Americans to focus on African Americans' cultural traits rather than on political economy. And despite Moynihan's liberal intentions, it directed attention toward family structure as a primary cause of inequality instead of such issues as work, taxes, housing, and education that I think offer better explanations. I say in my book that the Moynihan Report should be neither celebrated nor condemned, and I stand by that. But since my book was published, I think I've gone a bit further by pointing to its effective use by conservatives. Conservatives have really effectively used the report in its arguments, and liberals, including Moynihan, have either overlooked or condoned this use by conservatives. I mean, Moynihan and his supporters, they love to talk about how the left attacked him unfairly, but somehow they fail to denounce conservatives when they use the report to opposite ends. I mean, you would think if you really thought this was a liberal document that was a call to national action, you would be equally outraged by conservatives who use the report to say, we can't have national action, we can only have racial self-help, as you would be by leftists that attacked it, but somehow neither Moynihan nor his supporters have distanced themselves from conservative uses of the report. And I argue that regardless of Moynihan's intentions, which I do think were equivocal in any case, his report has become a Frankenstein's monster created by a liberal, but really has benefited the right. Thus, I think I've deduced that if we want to talk about the main reasons why African American inequality has persisted, I think the left would be best off, ignoring the report altogether or criticizing its negative dimensions rather than seeking to revive its own version of the report. But I cannot conclude without addressing what is by far the freshest and most inventive use of the Moynihan Report this year by Ta-Nehisi Coates in its recent cover story for The Atlantic, in which Coates uses the Moynihan Report to discuss mass incarceration, both seeing mass incarceration as a result of the failure to take action in Moynihan's time to address the problems that he outlined in other more just ways. But also, Coates sees the devastating long-term effects on African-American families and communities as similar to those that Moynihan discussed in his report as resulting from slavery and Jim Crow. I think Coates is actually mistaken in assuming the Moynihan report was an unambiguous case for national action. This is an argument that Coates makes, and which aligns him with some of the nostalgic liberals who've written about the report. But Coates does recognize the report's limitations, especially in terms of its commitment to patriarchy, and he makes effective use of the report to shed new light on a major issue. And unlike Police Commissioner Bratton, who picked up the report as explaining current events, Coates engages it in a way that fully recognizes the report's historicity. In fact, he uses it as a historical marker to comprehend the vast expansion of mass incarceration in the 50 years since. Now that comes as a pleasant surprise. I admit I didn't think that such inventive use could be made of the Moynihan report. By the time I finished my book, I'd become so tired of the same arguments endlessly repeated. Someone asked me, well, why didn't you devote more space in your book to the period after the 1970s? Because, of course, the dispute of the report continued. And I said, to do so would be simply to repeat the same debates over and over again, which would be boring both for author and reader. But based on Coates's really inventive use of the report, I'll just modify the cautionary lesson I drew earlier about using the report in contemporary discourse and just say that if it is to be used, it should be employed as Coates uses it, with a full sense of it as a historical document. Only if we recognize how the report was a product of its time can we use it effectively to understand our own time. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Daniel, you did mention Stanley Elkins and his study of slavery and the slave family, the devastating, by his account, impact of slavery, the psychology of that. And I understand that was a powerful influence on Moynihan.
Yeah, Elkins is, it's in the book, Elkins is a powerful influence on Moynihan, refracted actually through Glazner. Because Elkins, of course, makes this, in his book Slavery, makes this famous argument that slavery was like, Nazi concentration camps that had sort of totally destroyed the personality of the slaves. But Elkins didn't make any arguments about, what effects this might have on African Americans like a century later. But Glazner makes that link. Glazner's the one who makes that use of Elkins, and Moynihan picks that up from there. Now, this argument about cultural damage really could be used in a liberal direction, and was at the time, but it's criticized from another aspect of criticism I didn't really mention in this particular talk, but the criticism that I suppose the denial of inherent value to African American culture. When your report is just at the start of the Black Power movement, it is seen as sort of Exhibit A of a failure to recognize the value of a distinct African American culture. And Elkins gets caught up in that. And Elkins, there's a lot of scholars who get caught in the wake of the Moynihan report controversy, and Elkins is one of them. I mean, Moynihan's use of the report makes Elkins' work even more, controversial than it might have been otherwise.
And so to keep this going, and then afterwards, Herb Gutman and Genovese.
Yes.
That they were inspired to write their book partly to counter.
Gutman certainly is. Genovese less so. I mean, I think Genovese actually was a little more friendly to Moynihan, but Gutman absolutely. I mean, in fact, there's no question that this is why he writes the Black Family and Slavery and Freedom. Yeah. He specifically said that he wanted to, quote, thrash the Moynihan report in that book. And I think actually his effort to try to attack the Moynihan report is a limitation of that book. I mean, why he chose to go after this government, obviously the political thing, but he chose to go after the government report. He really should have been, as a scholar, he should have been going after someone like E. Franklin Fraser, on which Moynihan was based, but he was a much more substantial scholar, yeah.
Without trying to prove anything.
I have a separate question. it's tagging along this, but it's going in a different direction. Can you talk a little bit about how this report, or if this report, becomes a touchstone in broader culture, outside of academia? And I guess I'm not even talking about politicians per se, but I mean, there's the Black Power movement, there's the rise of hip hop, there's the rise of independent Black culture, and all sorts of conversations about poverty, about an underclass, about all sorts of things. They seem new now, but of course they're not, right? And so I guess what I'm wondering is, why the Moynihan Report as a touchstone for so many people rather than something else or some other explanations for enduring poverty, female-centered households, that sort of thing. So I'm asking you two questions here. I'm sort of saying, what's the significance in the broader culture, but also why do you see someone, a month ago quoting this report and not something perhaps more sort of timely and relevant?
Yeah, I think that, let me take the first question about the culture. I mean, I came across a great quote the other day that I wish I'd had for the book. It was in the New York Review of Books. This sort of left-wing journalist, Andrew Kopkin, he said something like, the things that are relevant right now are sort of the music of Aretha Franklin and the things that are going on in the street, and everything else sounds like the Moynihan Report. So the Moynihan Report becomes like a symbol for, out-of-touch white men, white men who don't know what's going on.
Right.
And I actually, Amir Baraka had a similar line about the Moynihan Report where he said, he was talking about a blues song, and he said, there's far more truth about Black families in this song than there is in the entire Moynihan Report. So there's a sense of it, the report as being a particular kind of document, and, coming from a particular part of society, and part of that has to do with when it's released, The other issue, I mean, it certainly helps that the report can be used by multiple sides, that it has appeals on many different issues to many different constituencies, both, I suppose, a positive or negative signal, and I think that helps to explain its persistence, and also the fact that it is a government report, it's something that, President Johnson at least read a summary of, it shapes public policy for a short time, so it's something people go back to and say, what possibilities were there, different than what turned out, in the Johnson administration at this time. And he wasn't just, some guy. He's in a very powerful position, and this report has, for a time at least, an important political impact. So I think that's another reason. But I wonder, especially, I said about Gutman, but you wonder, guys like William Jewis Wilson, I mean, why are they going back to the Moynihan Report? What they should do, even if they want to go back to Moynihan style of analysis, they should go back to E. Franklin Fraser, they should go back to Kenneth Clark. I mean, these are serious scholars who, in many ways, have much more rich and sophisticated views of African American families than Moynihan. So I guess that they just don't have the same kind of cachet in policymaking circles or in public debate, but the Moynihan Report has become widely known.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question. You mentioned earlier during your presentation how even members of the civil rights movement were in favor of the Moynihan Report, at least spoke approvingly of it. Could you say a bit more about the debates among African Americans about the report? Because you mentioned later on the Black Power movement and how some of them were opposed to, but you could say more about that, please, African American.
Yeah, I mean, the report has early support from Martin Luther King. I mentioned Whitney Young. They're positively viewing Johnson's Howard Address. They see the report as sort of connected to that. The people who criticize, in some ways, I mean, Whitney Young and King both have been speaking in almost identical terms to Moynihan about using the language of pathology, and even King used the language of cultural poverty, which Moynihan didn't use, but is synonymous with it. The people who challenge the Moynihan Report in the civil rights movement tend to be local activists. So I mentioned William Ryan before, who's a white activist in Boston, but very connected to CORE especially. He's on the ground, he's looking at issues of education, of sort of metropolitan politics, and he sees this report that says the reason for inequality is, we've got civil rights, everything's equal, so now the problem is going to be family structure. And he's saying, what is this guy talking about? I see institutional racism all around me, and sees the report as really dangerous for that reason. I mean, to some degree, some people in the NAACP view the report similarly. They said, well, the fact, what does he mean beyond civil rights? We don't have civil rights yet. These guys given the wrong impression. But I think it's really activists on the ground. Then when the Black Power movement comes along, and Stokely Carmichael targets the Moynihan report in his speech where he says we're going to use this phrase Black Power. Basically what Carmichael says is, one, the report's blaming the victim, but two, who is this guy Moynihan to be talking about us, to be talking about issues of family? I can't remember the exact line, but it's something about how all the people in the White House are out there talking about our mamas. Who are they to do that? This is for us to talk about. This is for us to define ourselves, which of course is the central demand of the Black Power movement.
So in your book, you talk about the criticism of Black masculinity and homosexuality.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you, when you're writing, if you considered how that pathology or ideology, I guess, informed how maybe perhaps Rustin and Baldwin supported the male breadwinner?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Rustin is a huge supporter of the male breadwinner family, and he says, he's directed about the Moynihan report, he says, in his article, he says, well, one thing we can all agree on is the need for, the male-headed family. He, of course, himself is gay, so it's interesting that he's supporting that. Of course, one could be gay and still support patriarchy in many ways, so that might be part of it. But yeah, I think there is an interesting angle that comes in there about the report, especially on Moynihan. He wrote in the Carnegie Corporation, which of course had put out Myrdal's American Dilemma, asked Moynihan what should they be doing. So he wrote a report for them. This is in 1966 after the Moynihan report is why they asked him. And one of the things Moynihan is worried about is, in fact, the mass imprisonment of African American men. But one of the reasons why he says he's worried is he says, well, while they're in jail, they're going to become gay, and then they're not going to be good, fathers and husbands anymore. So take it for what it's worth.
Before I ask my question, I just want to back up and thank Ed Madden and Women and Gender Studies for supporting this event and also African American Studies program. Thanks. I'm wondering, your book is about the reaction, largely about the reaction to the report, but it's also about Moynihan, and he's all through it. And so a couple of questions, what's your sort of take on him having done all of this? And Coates talks about original intent in this piece that I think you don't agree with. And I was also struck by his role in really elevating the profile of the report and orchestrating its defense during the 60s. So,
yeah.
He is someone that really is responsible for us probably sitting around talking about it to a certain extent.
Yeah, I don't think you can talk about a clear intent that Moynihan had in writing the report. Of course, authors don't necessarily know what they're doing when they're writing reports, and sometimes documents are shaped not just by their own views, but by what literally makes it in the document. As I mentioned before, okay, so maybe you support a public works program, but there's no mention of that in the document. So the document's shaped by these broader political circumstances. And Moynihan himself gave, different interpretations of what the report meant, depending on the setting. Sometimes he really stressed, look, I was making a case for national action. I wanted to support these programs. They weren't in the report, but I hope that this report would somehow lead to these. At other times, he said, actually, I was really worried by the idea that the situation was getting worse and that maybe there was nothing that we in government could do. So he gives both interpretations of the report at different times, and as he himself becomes more conservative, he shifts from one to the other. In the late 60s, he's a prominent member of this group known as the neoconservatives, the original neoconservatives who were liberals who were sort of reacting against the new social movements in the period and what they saw as the excesses of the Great Society. And Moynihan's one of their principal spokespeople. Of course, he goes to the Nixon administration and writes the benign neglect memo. And a lot of this comes, you know, so a lot of some of the neoconservative ideas are evident in the sort of stories that he tells about the Moynihan Report and the controversy, where he pretty much, as I mentioned, entirely blames the left. He says, well, these crazy, you know, these crazy liberals, these crazy people on the left attacked me. They failed to understand me. They didn't understand what I was after. He doesn't take any responsibility himself for, you know, perhaps having confused people. He doesn't address the fact that many conservatives took his report and liked it, but used it in a way different than what he said he thought it meant. But it gives a sort of narrative of, I argue in some ways it's the kind of origins of the idea of political correctness. You know, there's these crazy people, you know, on the left, and when it comes to race, they just can't see reason, and they'll call anybody who attacks them a racist. And that's another thing Moynihan always says, people attack me as a racist, I was vilified. You know, he did get attacked as a racist, but very few people early on attacked him as a racist. I mean, people had substantive criticism of him, people like William Ryan, and they're quite openly said, look, we don't think Moynihan's individually racist, but we think they're dangerous notions and his ideas. But Moynihan doesn't address the substance. He says, oh, I'm not racist. So this idea that Moynihan was kind of attacked and vilified as a racist, I see as a kind of a neoconservative narrative of the report that emerges in the late 60s.
I'm struck by how he was writing this right on the cusp of the feminist movement.
Yeah.
And right at a time when, as you say, the norms were about to change. I mean, just think about it. I can't remember, perhaps you know, which year it was that the census eliminated the question, head of household, and started putting who's filling out the document, you know. And I don't know, to me that was a really big deal when that happened. You know, just that the government was recognizing the fact that it's not a norm to put one person as the head of, you know, to reject that concept. But you know, he seemed to be, you know, such a bright, well-educated person who's looking around, and yet he seems so clueless about so much of what's happening in the society around him, and in terms of the changing social structure of the whole society, and the fact that very soon people were going to very much resent what he said about African American women being in charge is a bad thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, excuse me very much, but don't they deserve a lot of credit, and what's wrong with it anyway, and you know, that kind of thing. So it just strikes me as that it was such an important social document, and yet it was so out of touch with its own times in some ways.
Yeah, or quickly became out of touch, you know, in the sort of years to come, because, I mean, feminism certainly was well underway by 65, but actually in the initial criticism of the report, there's a few feminists who criticize it, feminists in the government especially, but they don't necessarily, their voices aren't heard, but, you know, 4 or 5 years later, it's a very dominant attack on the report. So it's partly the timing, but Moynihan certainly was, you know, he was part of a certain time and place, and he never understood why feminists, you know, attacked the report. He said,
What's the problem?
you know, he said, what's the problem? He said, well, he said, you know, I think women should vote, and you know, they can have careers, although they should be at home if they have young children. So isn't that a feminist? You know, that was really his view, but he wasn't too out of line with what a lot of liberals would have thought, you know, in the early 60s. So, you know.
Yes and no, because in just 2 years earlier, well, 1963, the JFK President's Commission on the Status of Women came out, which they call the American Woman. It was a government bestseller among government documents, and so another was another government publication.
Yeah, and Moynihan actually was the...
And it was supposedly a wake-up call for the nation, that the idea that was pervasive about what American families are like, that it wasn't actually the way a lot of people were living their lives. You know, that women are living many more years and having fewer children. They end up, all of these factors that propel them into the job market that have nothing to do with feminism. And yet, so sort of, a lot of people said that it was widely read, at least in government circles, showing that in fact these norms had already changed. And so it's kind of surprising that maybe you didn't read it.
Not only did he not read it, he contributed to it. He was involved in the Labor Department. It was done through the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor,
Yeah.
and when he was in the Labor Department, he contributed to it. There's memos where he's writing, and he actually says, look, he says, whatever you do, let's keep this idea of, the sort of the male breadwinner in charge. Let's keep that. And actually, there are many ways in which the report doesn't, in some ways it has what you're saying, but also the authors decline to make any clear statement contradicting the idea of the male breadwinner. And when he had quotes in the report, Dorothy Height, who's head of the National Council of Negro Women, and the quote is, she said that if African American women have a problem, it's African American men and their status. So Moynihan thought, reading that kind of stuff, when he was picking out the other stuff, he thought, oh well, the people agree with me, and he was really blindsided by the feminist criticisms.
There's a section in the book where you talk about the kind of cyclical nature of sort of the elites and then the public and public policy, kind of each influencing and playing off each other, involving the Moynihan report.
Yeah.
I was just curious, since most of the book, of course, is sort of this elite kind of status with their publications, and you do have a pretty good section about the public, how much power did you actually see in terms of looking through the archives of the public having this influence on what the elites are writing? I mean, was it as much as the elites kind of filtering down?
Well, I'm not sure that I've got a lot of evidence of elites, being directly influenced by the public. But in terms of the debate that occurs over the report, it's definitely not just an elite debate. There's a very public debate about it. One of the reasons I decided to write the book is when I went to the Moynihan archives, I found just hundreds and hundreds of letters of people writing to him about the report. Because it was a government report, so most people didn't know how to buy one, so people would write to him directly and say, give me a report. And they had different ideas about what the report was about. Some liked the ideas, some didn't like it, from all different perspectives. So I think there's probably a wider range of voices in that public debate that got left out of some of the elite debate. And one of the things that I picked up on that was interesting, where you do see Moynihan responding, is there are a lot of people who read the report as an argument for sterilization of poor women. Basically, that's what they say. This is the response. There's too many babies are being had out of wedlock, so we need to have forced sterilization of women, which was a very popular idea, at the time, actually, and it's actually. The idea is voluntary sterilization is in place in certain states, but you won't see that in any of the public debates about the report. But you've got dozens of people writing to Moynihan, some of them writing letters of editors of places like Life, suggesting this idea, to the extent that Moynihan has to come out and reject it. Moynihan said, I had a great line, he said, I will support your plan to sterilize black women as long as for every black woman we sterilize, we castrate one white man. That was his response. So.
Okay, well, we can talk informally over a reception, and thank you so much, Dan.
Dr. Sullivan, don't forget the brown bag and the happy heart.
Oh, yes, tomorrow, thank you, Jennifer. Gunter, who's Assistant Director of the History Center, and we are having a brown bag gathering tomorrow. And maybe let's just give a little nutshell of your current project. The next book that Dan Geary is working on concerns the meaning of integration. And so it will be an informal discussion with him about his current work and anything else that might come up. But can you just say a couple of words?
Yeah, so this would be a sort of intellectual history of the concept of integration in terms of race, how it emerged, the meanings it took on, especially in the sort of the civil rights era, if you like, and since. So it's really integration as sort of a broad concept, like what would an integrated society look like? And what I found is just very many different ideas of what that would look like among those who support integration. And of course, then it becomes a negative symbol for those who attack integration. So it's just the history of this concept, I suppose, throughout the 20th century. So I'll say more tomorrow.
No, that will be at Preston College in the seminar room at 12 o'clock tomorrow. Great. Okay, please help yourselves.
And please sign in if you haven't yet.
Yes, we're building our campus.